Now I am. All right, all right. Chapter 12 opens up with Abraham Lincoln. Two of our presidents, at least, James Madison and Abraham Lincoln, married above their class. Jane Madison, of course, when he married Dolly, she was a widow woman. She'd been married before, but her husband had died. But he married above his class. But in the case of Abe Lincoln, folks, some of this is stuff that's a little bit hard to understand. Mary Todd Lincoln was the daughter of a wealthy Southerner whose father owned slaves. And keep in mind, you may know later Abraham Lincoln himself turned against slavery. Mary Todd had grown up with slavery. But also Mary Todd decided as a young woman, I'm going to be First Lady someday. I'm going to be the wife of the President of the United States. She was an attractive woman, and she was courted by both Lincoln and Douglas. Stephen Douglas was a highly attractive up-and-coming man, what we might today call a yuppie. And any woman who wanted to be First Lady, she should have married Stephen Douglas, but she didn't. She married Abraham Lincoln instead, and guess what? She actually got to be First Lady. We'll talk later about how Lincoln managed to nose Douglas out for the presidency. But don't get me wrong, Lincoln and Douglas were friends. They remained friends throughout much of their lives. But Douglas had the advantage in a race. He was the front runner in a race. Lincoln was at the tail. Now, the fact that Lincoln also would marry Mary Todd. All right. Folks have told me that I shouldn't talk this way, but Lincoln, quite frankly, was ugly. Physically, he was unattractive. All right. Now, he one day, I don't know, it's not politically correct to say that, but how else can I say it? Lincoln was just simply not attracted to women. Lincoln, one day as a young man, attended what we might today call a single social, where a bunch of single men were getting together at a party. And here's what he says, that I could not get one lass, that was a word he used to describe a married woman, I could not get one lass to talk to me. He said, I finally cornered a lass and got a few words out of it, which she managed to escape my cornering. Couldn't get a lass to talk to him at all. But then when he finally married, he married a wealthy woman, a daughter of a wealthy woman above his class. By the time he got to be president, keep in mind, Abe Lincoln was born in log cabin. By the time he got to be president, he was in the top 5% of the country in wealth. He got there by hard work and by educating himself. He only had 1 year of formal schooling. Basically, you might say he went through the first grade. And he taught himself. He taught himself to read. And he read every book he could find, mostly the Bible, because it was readily available even on the frontier where he was growing up. Read Pilgrim's Progress. Today it's not read very widely. We have it in my home, but yeah, you've read it. Oh, yeah, I've read it. At one time, every American had a copy of Pilgrim's Progress. But anyway, he read those books, and he educated himself, and became an attorney. And I had a person this morning, how come so many of our presidents become attorneys? It's simply logical. Attorneys deal with the law all the time, so supposedly they know how to deal with it and how to make it. Anyway, all right, so much for the opening vignette. Oh yeah, Lincoln did hold office one time. We'll talk about that in a little bit. He went to Congress one time in 1847 to 1849. He never held an office in the 1850s. Lincoln, like Washington, took defeat after defeat after defeat, and at one point suffered what we might today call a nervous breakdown even. That served him well, because when he got to be president, his army suffered defeat after defeat after defeat. He lived long enough to see the war over and his side having won. And maybe lucky for him, he died right then, because if he'd have lived longer, his hands would have gotten dirty trying to clean up the mess that was made. But as it was, he died right at the height of his popularity, and today he's put on a pedestal next to George Washington, the founder of his country. His picture is on the penny, the most circulated coin there is. The penny doesn't have much value, true. His picture is also on the $5 bill. Who's on the one? Well, Washington is on the one. Lincoln is on the 5, the second most circulated bill there is. So, anyway, so he gets honored, highly honored, next to Washington. All right. America was growing at this time. The nation's population, I'm not going to write this down, was over 31 million by 1860. Americans are moving from farms to cities. Americans were beginning to work in factories and leave their farm. And steam became a source of power that enabled the factories to become more productive. Now, today's factories use servo motors, that's motors that run by hydraulic power, or they use electric motors. You don't find factories today using steam engines or using gasoline engines, but in those days factories used steam engines because the electric motor had not been perfected. I studied electric motors when I was in high school and still do somewhat. It took mankind 50 years to make the first really good one. There's more to it than you realize, much more. And yet in some ways it's so simple. But now, coal came into widespread use, again because it was abundant. We have still enough coal in this country to last us 3,000 years, and our present president wants us to use it. Coal is somewhat dirty, nasty, not easy to handle, not convenient, but it's there, and it can heat our homes and it can heat our factories, but it's not clean. The axe became the most used tool in America at that time. They used to use axes to chop down trees and clear the forest, but removing the stump was so difficult, they oftentimes let the stump sit there for years and eventually rot away, or they moved the stumps maybe one stump at a time. So they'd plant their crops between the stumps. And eventually now, what happened about bringing down trees, they developed a two-man saw, a long saw about 6 or 8 feet long, where that while one man would push, the other one would pull. One man would push, the other man across would pull. And they worked together as a team. And if you go to old sales, estate sales, you might still see the two-man saw. So if you go to some of these stores that feature old tools, you'll still see these long two-man saws. They came later. Today, of course, the chainsaw is used. And a chainsaw can cut better than anything mankind ever has had. But anyway, the axe was used in those times. They clear out the ground. Now, inventions helped. Cyrus McCormick invented the reaper. Now, the reaper, it would use horses, and the horses would turn, of course, as the wheels that touched the ground, the wheels on the ground turned, it was geared to where it would turn the cutters on the reaper really fast. So while the wheels would move at this speed, the cutters would move at this speed, and these cutters then would cut the wheat down. And the reaper could cut down many, many times more than the man could using a scythe. Now, a scythe, that's a sickle, a big sickle, usually about 6 foot long. It has a handle halfway down, and you cut the grass. Now, folks, using a scythe is really hard on a person's back. How many of you know what I'm talking about? One of you, okay. A couple of you, okay. I see a couple of you. Anyway, they used scythe before. Well, with a reaper could replace maybe about 50 scythes or so, because it could really cut the wheat. And it cut it all the same height, cut it fairly evenly. Then once the wheat was cut, it could be gathered up, and eventually they developed, your farmers used devices that gather up the wheat off the ground and bale it up into straw, whatever, and or grind up some of the wheat to make bread. Some of it becomes food for the horses and cattle. Another man made an invention, John Deere. Now, John Deere, you still see this name on tractors. John Deere he invented the steel plow. Steel is stronger than iron, but it's also lighter than iron and less prone to rust than iron is. The steel plow would last a good many years, and because of its sturdiness and light weight, it could cut the ground better than the iron plow they had before. So, and eventually, yes.
Well, John Deere, they've been in.
It's what?
John Deere, they've been in business for a long time.
For 150, 160 years, if not longer, yeah. Now, of course, the original John Deere is long gone, but the company that bears its name is still around, and they still make tractors. I believe they make riding lawnmowers also, and maybe a few other things, but there's John Deere company is still around and still very popular. America had a whole lot of land and not enough laborers, even with the invention of the reaper and the steel plow. There was not enough labor. Europe had the opposite problem. Europe had very little land left and far more laborers than it needed. Needless to say, a lot of European laborers came over to America. And by the way, when Europeans came to America, they tended almost always to move to the North. The North had more opportunities for them. This was one of the things. The number one reason the South lost the Civil War, folks, number one was the South was outnumbered, purely and simply. I mean, if you ever played chess and you get ahead of your opponent, then you can just spend the rest of the game trading your opponent one for one. Many of you know, trade your opponent one for one, queen for queen, pawn for pawn, knight for knight, bishop for bishop. And since you started out ahead, you eventually wear him down to where you'll still have fewer players than you. And he might eventually concede rather than play out the game. But in other words, the South lost the Civil War because they killed far more Northerners, but the Northerners kept coming back. The Southerners ran out after a while. Squatters, oh yes. A lot of your people could not afford to buy land. So the squatters would move in on government land, and the government did not try to stop them. A squatter would move in, cut down the trees, start a small farm, and stay there maybe for several years. Eventually he'd move on to another farm. He would not pay for the land. The government allowed it. But he'd grow enough crops to feed his family and maybe sell a little bit on the market. And he might get a hold of a few pigs and a few chickens and build a fence for the pigs and get a hold of a cow and maybe milk a cow or whatever. But they lived on land that they never bought. And they didn't stay. Now don't try that today, folks. The government today will not allow that. But you had a lot of squatters. And in 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed a famous law called the Homestead Act, that if you lived on a certain piece of land for 5 years, that is government land, like the land became yours. Now, you could not move on some land that was already owned by somebody else. I mean, you had to move on government land. But if you could live on government land for 5 years and work that land, at the end of 5 years, the land was considered yours. It was Lincoln's way of encouraging people to move west. Well, machinery was set up. Among the machines was a power loom. The first business, or the first that was really mechanized, was the textile. That has to do with cloth. Ways were found to spin yarn using machines, and the machines would spin the yarn evenly to where all this yarn had the same strength. And then power looms were invented to where this yarn could be woven into a fabric that would be much better than what you could weave it by hand. Power looms. No, these machines, though, were so expensive they could only be found in factories. Private homes did not have them. But this meant better quality clothing, better quality cloth, and cheaper clothing also, because the factories could put this stuff out and mass produce, and it would become cheaper. Now, interchangeable parts. This was the American system. After Eli Whitney had invented the cotton gin, yes, Whitney. Well, remember two things, he invented the cotton gin, he also started the American system. The American system was simply the system where that his rifles. He was told, make rifles that can be easily fixed. So Whitney said, I'm going to make a rifle to where all the parts will be the same size and the same shape. So every trigger was made from the same mold. Every hammer was made from the same mold. So where all triggers and all hammers, all stocks, you had to be parked over here where the men there did nothing but whittle down wood to make stocks. And some of the men whittled down wood to make the handle that was held. In other words, you can't hold directly to the barrel of the rifle, you'll burn your hands. So you have a wooden receiver, or whatever they call them, that protect your hand from being burned. And then you have, of course, the spring, the trigger, the hammer, the barrel. One department would make that a barrel, and all the barrels were alike. All the hammers were alike, all the triggers were alike, to where if a man came into you and said, I have a broken spring rifle, the repairman just pulled down a spring from the shelf. Before this time, he'd have to get out his hammer and anvil and hammer a part into place. But this time, if you broke the hammer on your rifle, you could have it replaced. It's called the American system, interchangeable parts. Now, they weren't as good as we are, and what they do, they made the triggers slightly bigger than they need to be because they had to file them down to size. So that it wasn't, today, of course, every part is made to such precision that you can take a part out of your car that's bad and replace it with the same part, and your car will work like it did before, provided you've fixed the right part. It's the part that was bad. But this is the American system, interchangeable parts. Railroads. You might wonder, why did the railroad come before the automobile? Well, the answer to that is the first railroads were made of steam engines. They tried making automobiles with steam engines, but the steam engine was so heavy that a man couldn't steer it, couldn't control it. More than one person was killed trying to operate a steam engine automobile. And finally they gave up and said, well, no, the steam is, so they put the rail cars, and because the steam engine is so large, they put the engine on the rails and put the steam engine on the rail. Then they had cars follow it, and you could get a lot of cars. At first, the cars were separated by chains, and it was found every time the train slowed down, these cars would bump into each other, so they separated them with separators. And the steam engine got better and better and better as time went on. The steam locomotive was to dominate American trains until the 1950s, the choo-choo train. Anyway, until the 1950s, it was found that diesels do a better job. The diesel engine is lighter in weight and has more power. The problem with steam is the combustion occurs outside the engine and a whole lot of power is lost getting that steam from the boiler to the engine, and then more power is lost in the engine itself. Whereas with an automobile engine, the combustion occurs inside the engine itself, in the cylinder. Same way with the diesel, the combustion occurs in the engine itself. And that means more power goes to where you want it, the wheels namely. All right, the railroads did more than anything else to make the United States a leading industrial country. But now during this period, the United States ranked second in industry behind Great Britain. Great Britain was first, United States second, I believe France third. Germany did not yet exist as a country. Samuel Morse invented the telegraph. But his telegraph was crude compared to today's, so all he could do was send dots and dashes. This was before they learned how to talk with a diaphragm microphone and the diaphragm speakers. It was several years before they invented the telephone. So anyway, Samuel Morse's telegraph would, you might say, talk with dots and dashes, dit and da. And now the Morse code he invented is not the one used today. Now, being a ham operator, I had to learn Morse code. Today, you don't. The most famous Morse code signal is the... Anybody know what I just sent out? Da, 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 did. The International Distress Call, SOS, I need help. At one time, everybody knew that. Today, I mean, I guess you don't. But here's a story one time. We heard coming from the middle of a wheat field one time, a car's horn sending out a beep, 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 beep. A bunch of us got out of bed and found a man who had been racing with a GTO, one of the fastest cars there is. He lost control of a car turning a corner and the car rolled over. He was still pinned underneath. His two male and female friends were thrown out. This is a convertible. They were thrown out, but he was still in the car, and he was still able, was conscious enough to blow the horn. We eventually got help to him, but it took a while to get help to him. And he stayed in the hospital a month before finally being released. But anyway, thanks to us hearing about him, we were able to come, and we could not lift the car, but a wrecker arrived. It rolled the car back over, and he was carried out in a stretcher. But in the International Morse Distress Call, Morse code, I need help. But today, the Morse code is not used as much as it was. But Morse invented the telegraph, and for the first time in history, mankind had a way to communicate over long distances instantly. But you had to have wires. Now, the radio was to come later. And to this day, the only way you can communicate with a moving airplane, a moving car, a moving ship is by radio. But that was to come later. These inventions were made one step at a time, folk. And yes, the first radios were Morse code radios. Dots and dashes. All right. Okay, I tell you what, it's just realized, let's see, yeah, it's 25 after 1. Be back in about, wait a minute, before you leave, I'll wait a few minutes. This. Everybody circle your picture, and if you don't see your picture, there might be one of you who was reinstated. If you don't see your picture, write your name in. Do that, and I'll, once I get this back, I'll give you a 10-minute break. Okay. This is a more efficient way to call roll, by the way. Now, the census is used to, and of course, if you're into genealogy like I am, you'll notice on the old censuses, is this person of foreign birth? Now, my great-great-grandfather, John Cunningham by name, came over in 1847, and he died in 1870. But on the 1850, 1860, and 1870 census, he's listed, yes, he was of foreign birth. Now, his sons, particularly my great-grandfather, William Wallace Cunningham, they would ask him, Father, are you of foreign birth? He'd check no. Was your father of foreign birth? No, not father of foreign birth, he would check yes. And this went on for a good many years. They'd ask these questions on the census. So that's how they know 1/8 of the American people in 1860 were foreign born. 1 out of 8. And most of the immigrants came from Germany or Ireland. Most of your German immigrants were industrious. The German people were so industrious that we're going to learn later they eventually thought they were the best people in the world, but they weren't. But they were highly industrious. But the other end were the Irish. Now here's a bad story of the Irish. Some man early in the 1800s bought a potato to be grown in Ireland on his farm. Every potato grown in Ireland was an offshoot from that one potato. What was wrong with that? That meant there was potatoes, you may like bananas, do not reproduce sexually. They would tend to reproduce by growing out like some other plants do. And by the way, somebody said we're going to have the same problem with a banana. All bananas in the world today are descended from one banana plant. And if those bananas become susceptible to an incurable disease, all bananas in the world might die. But anyway, what happened? A blight hit the Irish potato, and every potato in Ireland died before it ripened, while still underground. The solution would have been, but then it was to bring some other potatoes that were not closely related to that one that was bought in, because not all potatoes were susceptible to blight. If they had simply bought in some other different potatoes, the problem would have been solved. Instead, it kept trying to grow with the same potato year in and year out. And the result was a famine struck Ireland. The Irish, a lot of them came over here to the United States, and one of the most famous Irish immigrants was the Kennedy family. President Kennedy's great-grandfather came over here with nothing. Again, he was about to starve to death as a result of the potato blight. The Irish, though, were hated for 2 reasons. And folk, I'm telling it the way it is now. They were Catholic and they were drunks. Now, if that offends anyone, I mean, I'm not sorry, but that's simply the fact. Irish Catholics. Now, the signs appeared on factories, Irish need not apply. No, we will not take Irishmen. Now, I'm saying this, folks, being part Irish myself, and in a minute I'll present some genealogy chart here, my own personal genealogy. I do that during a break. That shows I'm part Irish myself. But Irish need not. The Irish were the last ones hired and the first ones to let go during layoffs. And these factories hire people when they need them in times of downturn, lay off workers. Factories still do that. But the Irish were hated. They were highly discriminated against. And it wasn't because they were black, because they weren't. They were as white as the rest of Europeans, but they were not made to feel welcome. All right. Again, your book mentions women's rights. A lot of women began to push for the right to vote. That was to come later. And you had your utopians, transcendentalists. The transcendentalists believed that we must find our guidance from within ourselves. Don't read the philosophers. Don't read the Bible. Look inside yourself, because within us is everything we need to find our own personal guidance. And folk, every time I say that, I feel like I need to wash my mouth out. There's some things I just don't believe. I mean, I'm sorry. You can believe what you want to, but I'll let you know my own personal feelings on the matter. Now, some of these men got together in communes. Now, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Thoreau, and Margaret Fuller believed in living solitary lives. They isolated themselves and lived alone. But one thing I want to say about Thoreau, I disagree with his lifestyle, but one thing he said, he who would be a man must be a nonconformist. It takes nonconformity, folk, to a lot of times to get ahead in life, because the crowd is going to remain on a mediocre level, and if you want to get ahead, you have to rise above the crowd. So, but anyway, but Thoreau also did not believe in paying taxes because that supported wars. Well, if you don't fight for yourself, folk, as the Jews found out the hard way during the Holocaust, people will throw you into ovens. That sounds gross, but nevertheless. I say this because my father was a pacifist. One of my brothers is a pacifist. I myself joined the army one time. Another one of my brothers also joined. I do not believe in pacifism. A shortcut to war, folk, is pacifism. That's how Adolf Hitler got so strong. Nobody wanted to fight anymore because war was so terrible. So anyway, now, I'll have more to say about communes, but I think I'm just about to get this thing back around. Everybody's signed except for you two, right? Everybody else fill out? Okay, be back in about 10 minutes.